So let me begin with both a thank you and an apology. Of course, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this event, and I want to apologize that I'm not able to be there in person with all of you, although I'm surely the main victim of that absence, not getting to be in Barcelona. Let me also apologize for speaking at a conference in Spain in English. I am a human rights lawyer, but I'm still an American human rights lawyer, so you have to be subjected to my linguistic imperialism and exceptionalism. It's actually probably a benefit that we got to hear Caspar first, because I'm planning to speak in somewhat less detail about some of these revelations, and I hope that we'll have some time afterwards for questions and conversation about this. It's obviously been quite a remarkable year for all of these issues. There is a historic global debate about surveillance and privacy, about democratic oversight, about technology, even about journalism. And we've just seen the leading journalists on the Snowden stories receive the highest journalistic awards in the United States. They've also received those awards in Europe and in other countries, which is great to see, not only because it acknowledges the work that they've done, but because it really has inspired their competitors to be less acquiescent, to use Caspar's term, to the exaggerated demands of the security state that have in the past intimidated journalists out of publishing these kinds of very important stories. I'm going to address a few issues. First, I want to make a few general remarks about the problem of democratic oversight of secret government programs, the backdrop for Snowden's activities here. I want to say just a little bit about the criminal regime in the US that Snowden faces or would face if he were brought back there, which I think is also the core of his argument for asylum. And then finally, I will speak very generally about what I think are some of the most important revelations and why I think it would be really an outrage for the person who initiated this global debate to be punished rather than celebrated for what he did. So the question of secrecy and a democracy is not a new question. It's not something that has arisen for the first time in the age of terrorism. If you believe, as I think many of us do, that there are some legitimate government secrets, then government secrecy will always present a conflict of core values, self-government and self-defense. If we don't know what our governments are doing, we can't consent to their actions or hold them accountable. If we do know what they're doing, then the rest of the world knows as well, including enemies. And so these questions will always involve some clash of core values. Bart Gellman of the Washington Post frames this as a question of self-preservation versus self-government. And any proposed solution to this issue, to this conflict, that doesn't take both of these into account hasn't even really engaged the central problem. So how are we supposed to, in general, negotiate this? Who gets to decide what will be public and what will remain secret? Another more provocative way that this question has been asked in the last year is, who elected Edward Snowden? Who elected Glenn Greenwald to make the decisions for the rest of us about what should be secret and what should be public? And to answer that, let's look at a different scenario. What if governments had exclusive control over what information we could see and what we couldn't see? Now, it cannot be that that is the correct answer to this conflict. If the classification stamp of a government bureaucrat were the end of the inquiry, and everything that the government decided should be withheld from the people would be withheld, then essentially the government would have control over its own accountability. There would be no way for the rest of us to judge their actions, and where necessary, to hold them accountable. So one way that democracies have addressed this is to assign special parliamentary committees. In the US Congress, we have intelligence committees that are supposed to have specialized access to these programs and essentially to represent the rest of us. in carrying this out. Now, of course, even these committees only know the information that the executive branch, that the president in our case, wants them to know, so their oversight is always going to be incomplete. Even when they do know this information, they can't share it with the rest of us. Caspar was not the only one who was with Cassandra-like clarity complaining about this information before Snowden's revelations. Some of you may recall that Senator Ron Wyden, who was on the floor of the US Senate with his hair on fire, saying, if the people knew what I know about how the Patriot Act is being interpreted, they would be shocked and they would be outraged. Now that turned out to be true, but Senator Wyden never told us that. We had to wait for Edward Snowden to tell us that. Now another problem with congressional or parliamentary oversight, and why it's incomplete, is that very often the members of those committees, at least in the United States, are not the members of Congress who are most skeptical of the intelligence committees, but those who are the most loyal to it. Those who receive the bulk of their campaign contributions from defense and intelligence contractors, and those who are essentially wined and dined by the security state. There was an absolutely fascinating article in Foreign Policy magazine about Keith Alexander, until recently the head of the NSA. He had his command center, his headquarters, designed by Hollywood set designers to resemble the deck of the Starship Enterprise, a science fiction show, including doors that open up with a sound effect and a whoosh. And he would there bring members of Congress there so that he could show them all of the great toys that he had, all of these incredible capabilities for surveillance, all the analytical tools that they were being asked to authorize and to fund. Those members of Congress were not, as I said, the most skeptical. They were the least skeptical of the intelligence community. Now, it is true that Congress, at least in the US, does have moments of very energetic oversight in the 1970s and perhaps in the last few months. But those moments are almost always initiated by unauthorized leaks to the press and aggressive journalism, not by the ordinary workings of our oversight system. What about the courts? What about judges? What role do they play in all of this? And here I can speak a lot from personal experience, having spent most of the last decade trying to engage courts in the United States, at least, in oversight of illegal national security programs. I can speak with some authority in saying that the courts in the US have failed, at least, as I said, until Snowden. And they failed for a number of reasons. So when we have tried to challenge US practices on torture, on surveillance, we're often confronted with overbroad claims of state secrecy. Many of you will be familiar with the case of Khalid al-Masri, who was a German citizen who was kidnapped mistakenly by the CIA and rendered from Macedonia to Afghanistan, and there held for 5 months and treated brutally. When we tried to litigate his claims in US courts, we were told that the whole subject was a state secret, that even though Mr. Masri could relate what had happened to him, even though we had independent evidence that could prove what had happened to him, the CIA's claims of secrecy meant the case could not go forward at all. Contrast that to the European case involving Macedonia, where 17 judges unanimously held that Mr. al-Masri's rights were violated, and I don't think that the American courts compare favorably. More relevant to this issue, just a couple of months before the Snowden revelations, the ACLU was in the United States Supreme Court, bringing a challenge to what again we now know in part as PRISM, to Section 702 of the Biden Amendments Act. And what the Supreme Court said to us in a 5-4 decision was that we had no right to be in court. And we had no right to be in court because our plaintiffs couldn't prove that they had been victimized by the surveillance. And our plaintiffs couldn't prove that they had been victimized by the surveillance because that was a state secret. And that meant effectively that no one could go into US courts to challenge these programs, again, at least before Snowden, which is why I think that it was so significant to us at the ACLU that the very first Snowden document that was published by The Guardian was an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to Verizon Business Records, ordering it to turn over on a daily basis all of its records related to the telephone metadata of its customers, and the ACLU was one of those customers. So essentially, Mr. Snowden handed us the ticket to federal court that we had been looking for 10 years. So the courts have been very inadequate. Congress has been very inadequate. And that brings us to the issue of unauthorized leaks to the press. And one way of thinking about unauthorized leaks to the press is that they're kind of an immune system response to the problem of excessive government secrecy. You can think of them as a kind of safety valve for democracy. Now, of course, most leaks to the press in the United States and elsewhere can be called whistleblowing. Most leaks involve people in government who are trying to pursue their own agendas and to put information selectively before the public. But let's focus on leaks like Mr. Snowden's, unauthorized disclosures of conduct that the government tried very, very hard to keep secret. In the decade since 9/11 in the United States, without unauthorized leaks to the press, we would not have known that the case for war in Iraq that the Bush administration advanced was based on deliberate lies and exaggerations. We would not have known that American soldiers tortured and sexually humiliated prisoners in Abu Ghraib. We would not have known that the CIA set up a network of secret prisons around the world and used a rendition program to kidnap citizens off the streets, chain them to the floors of planes, and fly them to these places. We wouldn't have known about the so-called enhanced interrogation program, known to the rest of the world as torture, where prisoners were waterboarded, suspended from ropes, beaten, and treated in ways that the U.S. has always considered criminal when they were used against our own soldiers. We wouldn't have known that the Bush administration decided that the rules for foreign intelligence surveillance, as permissive as they were too cumbersome, and that they should just throw them aside and collect whatever information that they wanted. All of this information was classified, and not just classified, but classified at the highest level of secrecy. These were the secrets that the government said was most important to keep from the public. If we only knew what the government wanted us to know, our democracies would be weaker, not stronger. Now, in the United States, the government's attempt to keep this information secret relies on, in part, on criminal laws, but not mostly. In general, we don't need criminal laws in order to deter leaking, because the government controls the livelihoods of the people who would leak. If the government withdraws their security clearances, in almost every case they won't be able to work ever again, and that's enough deterrent. But on top of that, the government has access to something called the Espionage Act of 1917, which is a statute passed during the First World War, which broadly criminalizes the gathering, receipt, and dissemination of what it calls national defense information. Now, in practice, this is what you might call a strict liability criminal regime. Virtually any deliberate leak of classified information to an unauthorized recipient will fall within the reach of this statute. The government can prosecute most, if not all, employees, ex-employees, and contractors for these kinds of leaks. By its plain terms, actually, the Act probably extends to journalists and publishers as well, although no journalist or publisher has ever been prosecuted under these laws. And the trend of the case law, more and more, is that any classification decision by the executive branch will be enforced criminally by courts. There is no public interest defense. There's no burden on the government to explain why the information was classified or withheld in the first place. There's no opportunity for the accused to say that the value of these disclosures far exceeded any punitive or claimed harm to national security. And in fact, the U.S. government has argued in recent court filings that leaks to the press are actually more dangerous to the government than the sale of secrets to foreign powers, traditional espionage. Because when secrets are sold to foreign powers, they're only sold to one power, generally. But when they're published in the newspaper, all of our enemies get to see this information. So this is the state of the law that Edward Snowden confronted when he boarded a plane to Hong Kong. It was a criminal regime that does not distinguish remotely between leaks to the press in the public interest and the sale of secrets to a foreign power. They are treated identically under the law and can be punished just as harshly in both. And what did Snowden reveal? We heard much of this from Caspar, and perhaps we'll hear more from Katarzyna, but I think if you were going to assign one, try to sum this up in a single sentence, what is the lesson of the last year? It is that across the world, the development of surveillance technologies and practices has far outpaced democratic controls on those technologies and practices. Now, this is something that privacy advocates and surveillance experts have been worried about for a long time, in part because of the plunging cost of storage and the development of technology that we've known that it was becoming technologically and financially feasible for the first time for governments to collect and store all of the world's communications. It used to be, of course, that governments had to make resource-based decisions about who they were going to follow, what they were going to collect, and what they were going to store. If you consider something like GPS, in the world before GPS tracking, if the government wanted to know your location, it probably had to assign teams of agents to follow you around, whereas now one agent can sit at a laptop computer and track hundreds or thousands of people in real time. What Snowden gave us was evidence that this was not just theoretically possible, but was occurring on a mass scale, mainly by the NSA and the GCHQ, but we should understand that these technologies, as they get cheaper and as they proliferate, will be available to many, many countries, if not most or all countries. That the essential mantra of the NSA has been, let's collect it all. We'll worry about the authorities later. We can bend and shape legal interpretations to accommodate the new technological capabilities that we have, and thereby construct a surveillance time machine that allows us to hit rewind on people's lives. We learned recently that that includes, at least for one country and maybe for several more, recording every single phone call that takes place and storing that in new storage facilities. And that this is backed by a legal theory. Now, Caspar explained that the U.S. has always treated quite differently U.S. person information from non-U.S. person information. But even for U.S. person information, the government's theory is that nothing of legal or constitutional significance occurs when these communications are intercepted and stored, but only when these databases are queried in search of a particular person or a selector. That no search or seizure occurs under our Constitution if our communications are just snatched and put away, but only if agents then look into those big databases in search of something. Do they need any kind of permission to do that? So many have questioned why this is dangerous. The government has argued very forcefully in the United States that it doesn't matter what it collects, it only matters what it looks at. I think one danger of mass surveillance, and there are many, is that mass surveillance, these massive databases, are not very useful for stopping terrorism for a number of reasons. Simply, there isn't a lot of terrorism, and you don't find needles by building larger and larger haystacks. But these databases are extremely useful as forensic tools, and therefore they won't be limited to terrorism. The pressure from law enforcement will be irresistible to gain access to these databases. So that information that was collected and stored on the justification that it would be used to stop terrorism is going to be increasingly available to our police agencies and even to our local police agencies. And then our societies are going to look quite different. And I would also say politically, that if we collect all the dots will always connect in hindsight. Any catastrophic event that occurs in the world will have been preventable, according to surveillance proponents, if only they had access to information that was sitting in these massive databases. The rules will be blamed for our failure to prevent these attacks, and the rules will be pushed aside. And this is what Snowden was discussing in his very first interview for the Guardian website when he talked about the danger of turnkey tyranny. That if we allow governments to sit on all this information, and the only thing that is protecting us from very, very abusive applications is a set of rules that are flimsy, then those rules will be pushed aside in times of war, in times of terrorism, and we will have lost freedoms without any kind of real debate over them. So Snowden observed this architecture being deployed, being used, without any kind of public debate. He observed the failures of democratic oversight. He watched as his superiors in the NSA lied blatantly to Congress and to the American public. He watched as the courts dismissed lawsuits that asked a simple question, are these practices legal? And he recognized that the only way to initiate the public debate that should have occurred before and not after the deployment of a global mass surveillance regime was to bring the public somehow into this discussion by bringing journalists, selected journalists, into this discussion. And so, as all of you know, he provided information to 3 journalists. It bears repeating that Snowden himself has not published a single document, that he instructed the journalists to correct for his own biases. This was someone who had spent his whole adult life in the intelligence community himself, and he did not trust himself to make these decisions for everyone. Rather, he wanted to entrust these core decisions to journalists and their editors in consultation with governments where necessary. And I think the results have profoundly vindicated that strategy. They have revealed, most important in the United States, that our intelligence officials had lied to us about what information on Americans they were collecting, and that in fact there was mass unregulated collection, that the NSA had violated its own rules thousands of times every year, according to previously secret internal audits, that the NSA was systematically undermining basic encryption systems of the internet, making it impossible to know if sensitive banking information or medical information is truly private and damaging businesses that rely on this trust. That overseas, the NSA had replaced targeted collection with bulk collection, that it is collecting billions of records on a daily basis from people around the world who are not suspected of anything, that the NSA was not only going in the front door of technology companies with court orders under PRISM, but also going in the back door by hacking into their communications links, finding places where data was unencrypted and stealing that information, pushing these companies now to strengthen their protections. That there had been a secret body of law that we hadn't known about that had justified much of this. Long opinions written by secret courts that analyzed the Constitution and analyzed the statutes, but that the public was not allowed to see. Recall that one of President Obama's first offenses of the NSA after this initial Snowden leaks was that we really had nothing to worry about because these programs were all legal and they had been blessed by all 3 branches of government. Well, that was precisely the problem. The problem was that all 3 branches of government had blessed these programs before the public knew what was going on. And now that the public has been brought into the debate through journalism, you've seen in the United States, all 3 branches of government engaged in historic reevaluation. Now, I share Caspar's skepticism about what some of the outcomes will be here, but it's very critical that issues that have been relegated to secret courts are now being debated and decided by public courts, and we've already had one federal court in the United States say that one of the key NSA programs is unconstitutional. We've seen the debate move out of secret congressional committees into a full Congress, and again, not just in the United States, but in the European Parliament and the Council of Europe, and in inquiries in many individual countries around the world about this. And even the President of the United States has appointed hand-picked review panels to reassess what the NSA was doing, and even those panels have concluded that the NSA allowed its capabilities to get ahead of our law and values. So this is a fairly extraordinary opportunity for us, and as Snowden said to Bart Gellman of the Washington Post, essentially my job was done. My job was to bring the public back to the table, to give all of you the information that you need, but now really it's in the public's hands. The change that we get will be the change that we demand. The change that we get will be the change that we require our legislatures to enact for us, that we persuade our courts to order for us, and that we demand that our technology companies provide for us. And I do think that one very important part of the debate of the last year has not been about law and policy reform, but about how we can enlist technology to protect our rights in ways that law has been very, very inadequate at. So I'm going to stop my remarks here. I look forward to a lively conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.